Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and today I'm joined by Sam Heller and Aron Lund, and we're here to talk about cross-border aid into Syria. Sam, Aron, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, as best I understand, mostly through following the writings and tweets from both of you, there's a July 10th deadline at the UN to decide whether cross-border aid can be allowed into Syria after the summer. And I actually am at this point am somewhat confused as to what's being debated at the UN, what is left of cross-border aid, and how crucial it is. So maybe can you two start by taking us through a little bit of where we are with cross-border aid in Syria and why it's important and what's being fought over at this stage?
Sure. So I'll go first. Lots of Syrians need aid, right? Because there's been a 10-year war. The economy is in tatters, and you have, I think, 13 million or something like that people who are in need of UN or NGO aid in some form. But a lot of those people live outside of the Syrian government-controlled territories, and that's always been the case because those areas were worst hit during the war because Assad has been bombing them, and they're poor and they're war-torn and so forth. So since 2014, the Security Council has arranged for a special exception to the normal order of things when it comes to humanitarian aid, which is that the Syrian government or the government of the country where UN aid operations take place, the government decides who gets to go across the border, who gets to do what. But that didn't work in Syria because the Assad regime weaponized humanitarian aid. It weaponized access to humanitarian aid. It didn't allow convoys to go into rebel-controlled areas. It didn't allow aid groups to work with communities that weren't loyal to the Syrian government. So you had an enormous crisis brewing by 2013, 2014 already, and hunger being used as a weapon of war. And at that point, the Security Council issued a resolution that basically allows the United Nations to use specific designated crossings at the border to go into Syria and deliver aid without the permission of the Syrian government. And that's what's called cross-border aid, because you cross a border.
And these are Syrian borders that are not actually controlled by the government of Syria. That's why the UN needs to be the authority to allow people to cross it.
Exactly, because if the Syrian government controlled that border, it could block it anyway, right? Because it just physically be in the way of the convoy. So originally there were 4 of these crossings in the resolution in 2014, and then step by step that number has decreased. One of them in the south to Jordan was recaptured by the Syrian government in 2018, so that's defunct for that reason. And then 2 others, one to Turkey and one to Iraq, to the Kurdish-controlled areas in northeastern Syria, have also been taken out of the resolution as it is renewed annually, or in some cases biannually, by Russia, basically, because Russia allowed this to happen in 2014 on the understanding that the resolution wouldn't be permanent. It would be an exception that would have to be renewed with the support of the Security Council. And since Russia has a veto in the Security Council, that gives Russia final say every year. So Russia has basically picked off crossings until there's now only one of them left, called al-Hawa, which goes into the Idlib province in northwestern Syria from the Turkish border, from southern Turkey. And that's what it's about now.
And what is Russia's case for reducing the number of crossings through which aid can go to millions of hungry people? Is this an overt just doing the bidding of their allies in Damascus, or is there more to the Russian position on this?
Well, basically it's that. They think Assad should be in control of Syria, or the Syrian government, and he runs the Syrian government. And they want this as they see it, abnormal exception to end at some point. But also it's an issue that has given them a lot of leverage because it keeps popping up every year since 2014. And then you have to renew it, and then you have to talk to Russia, and Russia tells you what it wants in return. And for the first few years, they didn't demand anything in particular in return, or at least it wasn't a big issue. But from 2017 onward, when Assad was back in control of most of Syria, they've been basically saying we need to wind up this cross-border mechanism. We don't like it. It's suspect. Aid is diverted to terrorist groups or to opposition groups, and we want changes to it, or we want it gone. And step by step, they removed it. And there's been big battles in the Security Council about this, with Russia vetoing resolution after resolution, and because Russia never has a majority on this issue, because most of the Council tends to vote with the Western-led camp. Russia basically has China and maybe another one or two other countries on its side, depending on the composition.
But they don't need a majority. They can just exercise their veto.
A veto of one is enough. China tends to sort of chip in. When Russia made its mind up, then China votes the same way. They let Russia take the lead, but they're not sort of driving events like Russia does.
Well, and I feel like you've started to say this, but so July 10th is the deadline, and what's at stake here? Is this millions of people who will suddenly start going hungry if this border crossing is closed to aid? Is this a case where if the crossing is closed, it becomes easier for the regime to retake those areas from the rebel groups that still hold them? Or what changes if this crossing is closed to cross-border aid?
Well, basically all of those things, I think, because what ends on July 10, unless there's an agreement in the Security Council, is all the UN aid going across that border, because the UN agencies, by their own statutes, cannot go across that border without Assad's permission unless this resolution exists to allow them to do that. So they can't send aid, they can't send funding to the NGOs inside Syria. There are, they fund doctors, they fund schools, they fund things that keep society running in these areas. And all of that will end. And also, a lot of the aid is not, it doesn't enter Syria through the UN. You have a lot of NGOs working there, whether, you have also Turkish organizations like the Turkish Red Crescent and others. But a lot of the aid is UN, especially a lot of the food aid, which is very important in this area, of course. And even the NGOs working in this area, I think Sam can elaborate on this as well. Even the NGOs in this area depend a lot on the UN. Its capabilities logistically, or in terms of coordination and planning and needs assessment and these kinds of things.
Do they need the cross-border authority as well, or can they keep operating even if they're...
If you ask the Syrian government, they certainly need it, but they don't ask the Syrian government, or they don't tend to. But a lot of them are uncomfortable with working in a place like Idlib, which is run by Tahrir al-Sham, which is a sort of an offshoot or a breakout faction from al-Qaeda, which is terrorist designated by the UN and a lot of other countries. So it's very easy to go into Idlib with aid and then get tangled up in counterterrorism sanctions, which for an aid group that depends on donations can be fatal. So a lot of them feel that they don't want to work in this area, or they can't afford to, because of those risks, the legal risks and the security risks also. They need the UN to do it. But a lot of them will, of course, continue to go across the border in collaboration with the Turkish government or with other organizations that continue to do it independently. It's just that it will be a lot less effective, I think.
Sam?
No, it seems that... So if the cross-border authorization is lost for this last crossing at Bab al-Hawa, it seems that the arrangement will much more closely resemble what we have now at Samalka or Fishkhabur, which is the main crossing that is used from Iraq's Kurdistan region to Syria's northeast, where NGOs are able to operate, outside UN auspices. So you will, in all likelihood, continue to see aid coming into Syria's northwest from international NGOs, local organizations and charities, some, regional, national organizations. Turkey obviously has aid institutions. But the consensus among humanitarians seems to be that what aid response to the Northwest persists, will be substantially reduced quantitatively. There will be less aid just because they will lose the UN's contribution, both in terms of just the material contribution, but then also just the UN's ability to procure in huge volumes, to arrange the logistics that are necessary for the amount of aid that is needed in this area. And then the continued response will additionally be just worse qualitatively. It will just be much more discombobulated and less organized than now exists.
How many millions of people are we talking about in the affected area?
So I think it seems that there are more than 4 million Syrians who live in the opposition-controlled Northwest. So that includes Idlib and adjacent areas, which is under Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's control, as well as adjacent sections of the northern Aleppo countryside, which is controlled by kind of more factions more closely linked with Turkey. So you have a little more than 4 million Syrians across all these areas. More than 2.7 million of them are internally displaced and are thus especially vulnerable. 1.6 million live in camps and are thus, again, particularly dependent on humanitarian aid. 2.4 million, again, of more than 4, are now reached by this UN coordinated cross-border aid response. So without Bab al-Hawa, then that falls away. For food aid, for example, I mean, this is an area that this is something that I encountered working on my recent paper for the Century Foundation on food insecurity and hunger across Syria. This is a corner of the country that is especially food insecure, in large part just because it is so densely packed with displaced people, many of whom have exhausted whatever means they had to support themselves, to cope with their circumstances, who live in camps, who cannot earn to support themselves, and then so this is an area that is especially food insecure. It is for now, reached cross-border, and then there are apparently like 1.4 million people in this area who are reached cross-border with food aid as part of this UN-headed response. NGOs have come out and said that, if they lose that UN contribution, they will be able to compensate partially, but then only a small part. So they estimate that that they will, I think, be able to meet about 300,000 people of that 1.4 million, and that so more than 1 million people will be who now currently depend on this food aid will just be left out, will be in the cold.
Well, so some of the rhetoric that I've heard from Western officials at the UN, so there are different European and U.S. Diplomats at the UN, they've described this as a humanitarian emergency in the making, or a catastrophe, or a major harm to millions of people. So can you two tell us in your own assessment how big of a, so I mean, these numbers that you're both putting out are, they're daunting and terrible when you start thinking about 1.4 million people who might be the sort of anodyne term food insecure. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people who might start going hungry, and who will presumably be subjected to a renewed armed assault by the government that's been trying to retake the areas that they're in. And on the other hand, we've talked about this a lot. Humanitarians especially have a track record, including especially in Syria, of sort of raising the alarm with the worst possible case scenario at every juncture. And some of the times those dire predictions have been true. Some of the times they've been maybe exaggerated. And so I want, in your assessment, how big of an emergency and how big of a human risk are we facing here if Russia single-handedly decides to close this border crossing on July 10th? And maybe we'll start with you, Aron.
So I agree that there is a track record of humanitarian organizations sort of playing up problems, because that's their job after all, to respond to those problems. And but also they are playing up this problem because it is really severe. And I think this time this is really serious. This is the last point of UN access to this area, which is the most deprived, the most vulnerable area of Syria. Which is saying something given the state of Syria in general, So I think this is really, really serious. And what they've been doing already is, the UN organizations and NGOs as well, is to rush aid in and pre-position things in stockpiles in Syria or just across the border where it can be brought into Syria easily with Turkish assistance and so forth. So they hope to have a supply ready if, the border is closed. And maybe they can go on until September or something. But eventually this will be a very, very, very severe crisis, I think. And you mentioned this because the political effects here are also significant, because if you have this kind of crisis, it will probably destabilize the arrangements that have kept Idlib not peaceful, but semi, compared to what it could be, reasonably calm for some time. Since March 2020, there's been a ceasefire that has held more or less, and that is to do with Turkey and Russia, their negotiations, which is also a big part of this process, even though it's kind of plays out in secret behind closed doors. So if those arrangements were to collapse and Russia and Turkey start battling it out, or their proxies do, the needs will shoot up immediately. It's not just about keeping the current situation going. It's also about what happens if you have a crisis, a military crisis, as a result of this, or infighting in Idlib, or you can have a lot of problems that stem from this decision, and then you'll need UN support to deal with that. And we've seen that in the past. Whenever there's major fighting flares, as it did in winter 2019-2020, for example, then immediately you had spiking humanitarian needs, and then you had to rush in a lot of supplies just to get that into stabilize that situation, because people who have nothing end up running for their lives, and you have to find them and feed them, basically. And unless you have these capabilities that are now working in Syria through the cross-border mechanism, then that will be really, really hard. So I think it is really serious this time. And there will be exaggerations, there will be warnings that won't pan out, fortunately, if the worst happens. And I think some of the statistics regarding population figures, for example, are not probably very reliable. But all that said, I think it is really, really serious.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the negotiations themselves and about what happens afterwards. I think I saw some things you were saying, Sam, about Russia's position here, and I'm interested in maybe you explaining how you, like, what you've learned about how Russia is approaching this negotiation. And I'm also interested in the sort of longer term thing here, because as I read it, Russia is basically saying, our clients or our partners, the Assad regime, have won this war, and we are no longer going to permit this temporary arrangement that was put in place for a transitional period when the outcome of the war was uncertain. And so from their view, continuing this cross-border aid is simply deferring the moment of reckoning, which of course they're happy about because it's their client winning. But is that a fair read? And maybe I'm asking you too many questions all at once. But let's go to you, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a large part of the impetus for a piece that I wrote recently for this organization, Dawn's magazine, Democracy in Exile, was as at least as I saw it, sort of a corrective regarding Russia's position here, which I think has been seemingly mischaracterized in a lot of reporting and analysis on this issue. I think that since earlier this year, there's been people have been kind of pointing to Russian statements and saying that the Russians seem intent on vetoing renewal of the cross-border mandate. That they are dead set on this. I don't think that is the case. If you look at the Russians' periodic interventions at Security Council briefings on humanitarian conditions across Syria, and then certainly some of their more recent kind of media comment at press availabilities, et cetera, on this issue, they don't seem to be signaling that they are, determined to veto this and to bring to an end the cross-border authorization. They seem immovable on a proposal from the West to re-add several crossings, including Bab Salame and Ayarobiya. So that's with Turkey and then with Syria's northeast. But on the maintenance of Bab al-Hawa, they tend to kind of to list this.
What are the things they want in exchange for allowing this to continue?
Well, what they indicate is that
they're looking for Western concessions.
And again, so that is the other thing on which I wanted to kind of attempt to offer a corrective, because I think there's been a lot of speculation about what they seem to be seeking from the West. Whether that is a sanctions relief, et cetera, which I think has been at issue in past renewals. But in this instance, the point that they...
Sanctions relief for Syria or sanctions relief for Russia?
For Syria. But in this instance, then the point that they continue to return to is some sort of advance progress on cross-line aid to Idlib. So cross-line, that would be from areas of government control, adjacent to Idlib into this area. They seem to they focus in particular on a stalled convoy that has been under discussion that would cross through the West Aleppo countryside into a section of West Aleppo that is adjacent to Idlib, and that the Russians and the Turks have failed to so far to successfully broker, apparently because of resistance by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to the participation in various capacities of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. which Tahrir Sham considers, an appendage of the government in Damascus. So that is what the Russians really harp on.
If I'm to translate that into sort of simpler or sort of wider vantage point, what I understand you'd be saying is the Russians want to see more movement of aid within Syria from government to opposition areas before they're going to continue to allow foreign aid to come in from across the outside border. And understandably, all the fiefdom of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham doesn't want to allow aid to come in from Damascus, because ultimately that weakens its authority. Whereas if it allows aid to come in from abroad, it cements its authority over that area. And so that actually, that's very interesting, sort of long-term state building project, competing state building projects, right? Where Damascus wants to reassert its sort of state authority over these rebel areas, and where the rebels are looking to deepen their functioning as a quasi-independent, autonomous, international entity.
I mean, so this gets back to, some of the objections or the misgivings that the Russians voice about the cross-border authorization generally, is that, this is a temporary and exceptional abridgment of Syria's sovereignty. It's normal kind of supervisory authority over, the UN aid response and its borders. And so they justify, I think they have made various, variations on the argument, since 2017 that, that the conditions on the ground that necessitated this original 2014 cross-border mandate, have changed, that this is no longer just practically a necessity. But also, that they are keen to restore Damascus's kind of full and normal sovereign control over the entirety of the country, to reassert Syria's territorial integrity, and thus to avoid what they characterize as efforts by foreign powers that have supported the opposition or supported the Kurdish-led forces in the northeast, is to kind of solidify the division of the country and then its functional partition by means of this cross-border aid regime. So it looks like they are attempting to, with this, to reassert the integrity of Syria under the Syrian state's control, at least in part.
So, Aron, in the last section of time we have before we come to an end, take us to what happens after July 10th, and I guess you need to talk about both eventualities, whether this cross-border regimen is preserved for another 6 months or year, and then we're going to be right back here again, or if it's shut down.
Well, I'm not deeply pessimistic about the outcome of the vote in the UN. I think there are reasons for Russia not to veto this, and I think the US knows that, and all the countries in the Security Council have some willingness to compromise this time around. Some of that is to do with the Biden administration being having a new relationship to Russia. Some of that but most of it is about the situation in Syria, where Russia doesn't necessarily want a huge crisis to erupt in the northwest. It wants things in return. Sam mentioned them. And it might also want to squeeze something out of Turkey in return for making this work for another period, and then probably just keep this leverage and keep milking this issue as long as it can. But So, I mean, if the vote happens, if there's an agreement of some sort on or before July 10, I expect there to be a renewal of, either 6 or 12 months. Any period is possible, and then we'll return to this issue again. It will probably have to involve the cross-line option in some form. Some form of convoy will have to move either within a set time frame or in a set format or something. There will have to be some movement on that, I think. And the Russians are also asking a number of other things that are related to that, such as, having better control of who gets the aid, who distributes the aid. And those issues are really, really sensitive for the opposition because that relates to the Assad regime's ability to collect intelligence on people in that area and, perhaps also use that to put pressure on their relatives in government-held areas and things like that. So it's very sensitive stuff. But the Russians want some movement on these things. And I think realistically, and as Sam pointed out in his piece for Dawn, they will get some of that because they do have a veto, and a veto is a silver bullet. You cannot defeat the veto. If Russia is willing to use it, they can win this.
What's the point where this changes? I mean, this has been much like the arrangement between the U.S. and the SDF or the PKK or YPG in the Kurdish areas. It's a clearly temporary arrangement that is, not feasible long term for geostrategic reasons, but which can go on for years and years and years. What's the tipping point where this arrangement is going to have to change?
Well, I think accidentally or through poor handling of negotiations like these, it could change prematurely. But otherwise, I think the clock ticking here in the background has to do with the Turkish-Russian relationship generally, and specifically what they've created in Syria, where they back different sides, but they're always in touch. They're negotiating on behalf of their Syrian partners, and they are trying to sort of find arrangements that suit them both. And, neither country is a stranger to frozen conflicts. You have Russia in Ukraine and Georgia and other places, and you have Turkey in Cyprus, of course. So I don't think either of them is, in a hurry to wind up Syria and have a clean end to this conflict, but they're also not in agreement on how they should proceed forward. And that's always going to be a sort of a push-pull process. And this issue is one of those sort of points of pressure for Russia in this case, because Turkey just wants to keep the status quo.
Well, let me ask you another question. So, when a comparable model here is the KRG, right? The Kurdish areas of Iraq, which existed as a de facto, certainly different zone than federal Iraq starting in 1991. And yes, complicated different factors that permitted that. But ultimately, there's lots of scenarios you can imagine where border access to these areas doesn't require UN permission and doesn't occur through UN mechanisms. So donor countries, including the U.S., that want to continue to send aid into HTS-controlled areas or Kurdish areas, for that matter, could do so through a different arrangement that no longer was a UN arrangement, and they then wouldn't also be sending that aid through UN mechanisms. That's a way that one could imagine this status quo persisting for 5 or 10 more years instead of at 6 to 12 month renewable intervals. Is there any movement towards that sort of recalibration of the status quo?
I think there is movement in the sense that that's where the conflict is drifting. That is the direction things are going. But there's not really a conscious, deliberate push in that direction, except from the Turkish side is really pushing for that to happen, to have this kind of, they'd love to keep the UN mechanism and so forth, but they just want this place to stay and be stable and not produce refugees and chaos and trouble for them. And also have some leverage in Syria and blah, 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 many things. But that's the key issue there. I think if to have sort of a cleaner arrangement there that would allow the UN to get out of the feeding people business in Idlib, you would probably have to have a reduction of conflict that seems stable so that you can have rebuilding in these areas, or given that so many of the people there are not from the area, they're displaced from other parts of Syria, just building homes for them. And just making the place livable. It will never be prosperous. It will always be something like Gaza, or an abnormal place that isn't sustainable really without some form of aid from the outside. But perhaps that can be arranged through Turkey. But Turkey is unwilling, perhaps unable to shoulder that burden on its own at this point. Perhaps not in the future, but that will require, I think, a conflict that is not constantly at risk of erupting, and that requires some sort of more of a stable arrangement between Turkey and Russia, which may or may not require arrangements involving the U.S., the Northeast, many other things, Assad, this and that. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and I think it's going to be difficult, but it's not impossible.
Although, I think if I could just add, no, I think that a real concern, though, is that, if you look towards some of these more, what are, arguably more sustainable means to deliver aid to these areas that do not, hinge on these kind of these dramatic renewal votes every 6 months or 12 every year. It's not clear that type of aid just can meet this really concentrated humanitarian need in this area, right? This is a ton of people, and then they are jammed into this, this peripheral rural part of the country that was not meant to house this many people, right? So then, without an aid response of the kind that the UN is capable of supporting and coordinating, then it's not clear how you feed these people, and then how you keep this area just even minimally sustainable and stable.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, but like when Russia pushes now for cross-line aid, that is aid coming from Damascus. The UN's response has been that, fine, we want that too, but even if we had all the permissions and all the, facilitation we needed, that wouldn't be enough to cover the needs that would exist if we remove the cross-border response or the cross-border UN response. So,
and to spell out, we do not trust that kind of cross-line aid would be meaningful or follow the rules and laws.
We
have
course.
Almost a decade of evidence that the Syrian government will block convoys, block medical supplies, not let things through. So it's a fault. That's why I was describing the cross line as part of a Russian and Damascus initiative to further squeeze and vice the opposition areas that they were unable to defeat by force.
Yeah, to clarify, this seems like it could be useful as a means to, as a sop to the Russians, right? As like a symbolic gesture towards Damascus's, towards Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity in a way that would, satisfy the Russians sufficiently to kind of sensitize them to cross-border renewal, right? But then there is no universe in which cross-border aid could provide a comparable contribution to these areas, or could somehow replace a cross-border. Just that practically that seems impossible.
Well, and we're almost out of time. We're at 40 minutes, but I do want to ask, just as a sort of perspective on how this might unfold, two narrow but related questions. One, did the same amount of aid continue to flow as the numbers of crossings closed? Like, did they just move more and more of it into the one remaining crossing? And two, the crossings where cross-border aid was no longer authorized, do they not continue to be busy, vibrant crossings in which lots of goods and people pass just simply without UN authorization?
Well, I think the most of what travels through al-Hawa and all the other crossings as well is not UN aid. It's not even aid. It's trade. And I think what people mostly live off in Idlib as well is trade or local, agriculture or whatever. But the aid is needed to keep those people who do need this to help them survive. And it's not just food; it's a lot of different things. And also, as we mentioned before, it's also the funding for institutions that keep people alive and keep society running, like hospitals and salaries for doctors and teachers and other things. So you will not have like a complete disappearance of food in Idlib on July 11. But you will have a massive, massive humanitarian crisis at some point after July 11 if there's no renewal of this resolution. I think, you can probably shift. You could certainly theoretically build a cross-line response, a response from the government-held areas that would replace this effectively, in theory, but that would take time and it would take trust, and there is no trust. There's no one at all trusting the Syrian government. I think this includes the Russians, which might make them hesitant, who trust the Syrian government to get that right to control the aid and then not immediately start abusing it, being on their best behavior until they get the right to control all of it, and then immediately starting to play the aid card again. And also the problem of trust exists between the United States and Russia. The Americans feel that they've been burnt time and time again by Russia in Syria, whether it's chemical weapons or humanitarian issues or ceasefire negotiations and so on. And I think the Russians feel the same way also, probably. So this is really a big problem because logically and just going by interests and desired outcomes, you could probably find something that might work, over time with a little bit of pragmatism. But there is not that trust, I think.
Last question to you, Sam, and give us a short answer. Is this as a test of American interest and influence over what happens in Syria or in international diplomacy? What can we surmise about about America's changing fortunes and ability to steer events?
No, I mean, I think that I think that the Biden administration seems to be taking the correct tack to this. So far, I think encouragingly, they have signaled that alleviating humanitarian suffering, expanding, preserving and expanding aid access across the country is among their top Syria priorities. They've obviously invested a lot of energy and attention to this issue in particular, and in a way that's kind of contra, what we've seen with previous administrations, and in fights for renewal. It seems they seem to be leaning much more heavily on the carrot rather than the stick. They haven't adopted a really kind of aggressive, condemnatory approach with the Russians on whose vote they whose consent they ultimately depend for renewal. Instead, I think that they are pointing to the evident need in this area, and then I think at least implicitly, holding out the possibility of further cooperation on kind of areas of mutual interest in terms of meeting humanitarian needs in Syria. And I think that is, it seems like a recognition of how kind of functionally, the UN Security Council works, how, what seems likely to be the best approach, in my view, to secure renewal, just because, you cannot browbeat the Russians into this, right? It is not effective. That has been proven before, and then, if you attempt to just kind of to dictate outcomes here, then the Russians, they do not care. or they may be additionally difficult just to spite you. It's just not functional.
Sam, we're going to end it there because it's been 45 minutes since we started this conversation, and Aron's baby has not woken up yet, but we don't want to try our luck.
Yep.
So this was great. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. I've been talking with Sam Heller and Aron Lund, I think across 16 hours of time zones. And it's 1 a.m. in Sweden, where Aron is. And I think we should let him go to bed. You've been listening to Order from Ashes. Sam, Aron, thanks a lot for coming on.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the international affairs podcast from the Century Foundation. If you've enjoyed what you heard, please rate us and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll make it easier for other listeners to find us and help us to keep producing these conversations. Thanks for listening. Till next time.